In the frozen wastes of Solstheim, where ancient secrets lie buried beneath millennia of ice and snow, there stands a tale that predates the very concept of empire. It is a story of power beyond mortal comprehension, of knowledge so forbidden that it corrupts the soul, and of a man who dared to challenge the gods themselves. This is the legend of Miraak, the first Dragonborn, whose name echoes through the ages as both champion and traitor, saviour and destroyer. Long before the dragon wars that would shake the foundations of Skyrim, before the rise of the Nordic heroes whose names still ring in the halls of Sovngarde, there lived a dragon priest whose ambition would reshape the very geography of Tamriel. His story begins in an era when dragons ruled as living gods, when mortals bowed before their scaled majesty and offered tribute to beings who commanded the very elements with their voice. Yet among these servants of the Worm Lords, one would rise who possessed a power that even dragons feared. The Merethic era was a time of wonders and terrors, when the line between myth and reality blurred like morning mist over a fjord. Ancient Skyrim groaned under the weight of draconic tyranny, its people little more than slaves to creatures who viewed themselves as the rightful inheritors of dominion over all creation. The dragon cult ruled with absolute authority from their capital at Bromjunar, their masked priests serving as intermediaries between the mortal realm and their divine masters. It was a system built on fear, sustained by power, and maintained through the absolute subjugation of human will. But power, as history teaches us, always seeks greater power. And in the halls of a temple on a remote island that would one day be called Solstheim, a priest named Miraak gazed upon the black books of forbidden knowledge and made a choice that would echo through eternity. For within those pages, bound in covers of otherworldly leather and written with ink that defied the natural order, lay secrets that promised dominion over dragons themselves. The island of Solstheim was not always the wind-swept realm we know today. According to the ancient legends preserved by the Skull, it was torn from the very mainland of Skyrim by forces so catastrophic that they defied comprehension. The Skull speak of a battle that raged for days between two beings of immense power, their thuum so potent that it literally reshaped the world around them. This was no ordinary conflict between mortals, but a clash of titans that would determine the fate of nations, yet unborn. To understand Miraak's fall, we must first understand his rise. Born in an age when the concept of Dragonborn was unknown, he possessed a gift that set him apart from all other mortals. Within his mortal frame burned the soul of a dragon, granting him the ability to absorb the very essence of dragonkind and learn their ancient language with supernatural ease. This power made him invaluable to the dragon cult, elevating him to heights of authority that few mortals could ever hope to achieve. As a dragon priest, Miraak commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He wore the ceremonial mask that marked his station, an artifact of power crafted by dragons themselves and imbued with enchantments that transcended the normal laws of magic. His temple on Solstheim became a center of worship and sacrifice, where the faithful came to offer tribute to their draconic masters. Yet beneath the facade of loyal service, seeds of rebellion were already taking root in Miraak's ambitious heart. The turning point came when fate, or perhaps something more sinister, placed one of Hermaeus Mora's black books within Miraak's reach. These ancient tomes, created by the Daedric Prince of Knowledge and Fate, contained secrets that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. Each page promised power beyond imagination, knowledge that could reshape reality itself, and wisdom that came at a price few were willing to pay. For Miraak, however, no price was too high for the power he craved. Hermaeus Mora, known by many names throughout the ages, is perhaps the most enigmatic of all Daedric princes. The Woodland Man, the Gardener of Men, the Keeper of Forbidden Knowledge. All these titles speak to his nature as both benefactor and destroyer of those who seek to pierce the veil of ultimate understanding. His realm of Apocrypha exists as an infinite library where all knowledge, past and future, finds its home among towering stacks of books that spiral endlessly into a sickly green sky. When Miraak first opened that fateful black book, he was transported instantly to this realm of infinite possibility and infinite danger. There, among the writhing tentacles and shifting corridors of living knowledge, he encountered the Daedric Prince himself. What words passed between them in that first meeting remain lost to history, but the consequences would reshape the world above. For Hermaeus, Mora offered Miraak something no dragon ever could: the power to bend dragons themselves to his will. The Bend Will Shout represents perhaps the most terrifying application of the Thu'um ever conceived. Where other shouts might destroy or heal, create or banish, this forbidden power reached directly into the mind and soul of its target, overriding their free will and making them a puppet dancing to the caster's desires. For a Dragonborn, who already possessed the ability to devour dragon souls, this new power offered the ultimate temptation: complete dominion over the very beings he had once served. The knowledge came with a price, as all of Hermaeus Mora's gifts do. In exchange for this ultimate power, Miraak bound himself to the Daedric Prince's service, becoming his champion in the mortal realm. What seemed like a bargain between equals was in reality the first link in chains that would bind Miraak for millennia to come. Yet, in his arrogance and ambition, the first Dragonborn believed he could outwit a being whose existence predated mortal civilization. Armed with this forbidden knowledge, Miraak began to plan his rebellion. He could not move openly at first, for the dragons' power was still absolute and their vengeance swift. Instead, he worked in shadows, gathering allies among the dragon priests, who shared his ambitions or could be swayed by promises of power. 3 priests in particular, Archidal, Dukan, and Zachary Sos, became his most trusted servants, earning the title of acolyte priests for their loyalty to his cause. The transformation of these loyal followers marked the beginning of a new chapter in Miraak's story. No longer content to serve as intermediaries for draconic will, they became active conspirators in a plot that would shake the very foundations of the established order. Their masks, once symbols of their service to dragons, became tools of rebellion as they prepared to turn the very system that had elevated them against its creators. Yet even as Miraak gathered his strength and perfected his mastery of the Bend Will Shout, events in the wider world were moving toward a crisis that would demand his attention. The great dragon Alduin, the World Eater himself, had begun to display the tyrannical excesses that would eventually spark the Dragon War. Nordic heroes like Harkon One-Eye, Gormleth Golden Hilt, and Feldir the Old were already beginning to question the wisdom of draconic rule, laying the groundwork for the great rebellion that would follow. It was during this crucial period that these heroes approached Miraak, recognizing in him a power that could tip the balance in any conflict with their draconic overlords. They pleaded with him to join their cause, to use his unique abilities as Dragonborn to help them defeat Alduin and free the Nordic people from centuries of oppression. Here was an opportunity for Miraak to become the hero his people needed, to use his gifts in service of freedom and justice. But Miraak's heart had already been corrupted by his dealings with Hermaeus Mora and his taste of ultimate power. Rather than join the Nordic heroes in their righteous cause, he chose a different path, one that would earn him eternal infamy in the legends of the Skarl. He refused their plea, turning his back on his duty as Dragonborn and instead pursuing his own rebellion against the dragons, one motivated not by justice, but by his insatiable hunger for power. This betrayal would have consequences that stretched far beyond Miraak's personal ambitions. Without his aid, the Nordic heroes found themselves unable to defeat Alduin through conventional means. The World Eater's power proved too great for mortal warriors to overcome, forcing them to resort to desperate measures. They turned to an Elder Scroll, one of the most dangerous artifacts in existence, and used its power to banish Alduin forward through time, rather than truly defeating him. This Pyrrhic victory came at enormous cost. Alduin was not destroyed, but merely delayed, sent forward to a future age where he would return with all his power intact. The heroes themselves paid a terrible price for their use of the Elder Scroll, with at least one of them, Feldir the Old, being caught in the temporal vortex and scattered across time itself. All of this suffering could have been avoided if Miraak had chosen duty over ambition, if he had remained true to his calling as Dragonborn. Meanwhile, Miraak's own rebellion was reaching its climax. Using the Bend Will Shout, he began to turn dragons against their own kind, forcing these proud beings to serve him as they had once forced mortals to serve them. The irony was not lost on those who witnessed it. The slave had become the master, using the very tools of oppression to overthrow his former overlords. Dragon souls were devoured by the dozen as Miraak grew ever more powerful, each absorbed essence adding to his already formidable abilities. The dragons, faced with this unprecedented threat, responded with characteristic fury. They razed Miraak's temple on Solstheim, reducing centuries of construction to smoking rubble in a matter of hours, but their former priest had grown too powerful to be destroyed so easily. Protected by his newfound knowledge and abilities, Miraak proved capable of standing against multiple dragons simultaneously, his Thu'um echoing across the frozen landscape as he carved a path of destruction through their ranks. Yet even as Miraak's power grew, the dragons were not without resources of their own. Among the dragon priests, there remained those who stayed loyal to their draconic masters, who viewed Miraak's rebellion not as justified revolution, but as the worst form of betrayal. Chief among these was Vahlok, a priest whose power rivaled even Miraak's own, and whose loyalty to the dragons was absolute. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the very geography of northern Tamriel, a battle between two masters of the Thu'um, whose power would prove so great that the very earth would crack beneath their feet, and the sea itself would be forced to accommodate the fury of their conflict. The confrontation between Miraak and Vahlok began not with the clash of weapons or the roar of Thu'um, but with words spoken in the ancient halls of power, where dragon priests once gathered to receive their orders from scaled masters. Vahlok had discovered the extent of Miraak's treachery through careful observation and whispered reports from those few who remained loyal to the old order. When he finally confronted his former colleague, the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of impending catastrophe. Vahlok the Jailor, as he would come to be known, represented everything that Miraak had once been and chosen to abandon. Where Miraak had embraced forbidden knowledge and alien power, Vahlok remained steadfast in his devotion to the dragons who had elevated their kind above common mortality. His mask bore the scars of countless battles fought in service to his draconic lords, and his voice carried the authority of one who had never wavered in his convictions, never doubted the righteousness of his cause. The two dragon priests stood facing each other across a chasm that had opened not just in the stone floors of ancient temples, but in the very fabric of their shared history. They had once served side by side, had once knelt before the same altars, and spoken the same words of devotion. Now they faced each other as mortal enemies, each convinced that their path represented the only true way forward for their people and their world. When words proved insufficient to bridge the gap between loyalty and rebellion, when neither priest could convince the other to abandon their chosen course, the inevitable violence began. The first exchange of Thu'um shattered windows that had stood intact for centuries, sending crystalline fragments cascading down like frozen tears. The very stones of the temple groaned under the assault, their ancient mortar cracking as competing voices of power sought to impose their will upon reality itself. What followed was not merely a battle between two individuals, but a conflict between opposing forces that had shaped the world since the dawn of time. Vahlok's Thu'um carried the weight of tradition, the accumulated authority of generations of dragon priests who had maintained order through strength and discipline. His words of power resonated with the fundamental structures of reality, calling upon forces that had been established when the world was young, and dragons first claimed dominion over lesser beings. Miraak's voice, by contrast, carried the corrupting influence of knowledge that should never have been spoken aloud. Each syllable was infused with power, drawn from realms beyond mortal understanding, shaped by a will that had tasted the forbidden fruit of ultimate knowledge and found it irresistibly sweet. His Thu'um did not merely command reality to bend to his will, it threatened to unmake the very foundations upon which reality stood, replacing ancient certainties with chaotic possibilities that defied comprehension. The battle raged for hours that stretched into days, neither combatant able to gain a decisive advantage over the other. They fought through the corridors of Miraak's temple, their voices shattering pillars and collapsing entire chambers as they sought to destroy each other with words that carried the force of avalanches. They fought across the windswept peaks of Solstheim, their Thu'um echoing off distant mountains and causing the very ground to tremble beneath their feet. As the conflict intensified, the island itself began to respond to the incredible forces being unleashed upon its surface. Fissures opened in the earth, releasing clouds of steam that spoke of the molten fury burning far below. The sea around Solstheim began to churn and boil as competing waves of power rippled outward from the epicenter of battle, creating currents that would persist for generations to come. Trees that had stood for centuries suddenly withered and died, their life force drained by the metaphysical violence occurring in their midst. The Skull, those hardy Nords who had made Solstheim their home since time immemorial, watched in terror as their world literally tore itself apart around them. Their shamans spoke in hushed whispers of prophecies coming to pass, of ancient warnings about the price of hubris and the danger of mortals who sought to claim powers beyond their station. They gathered their families and fled to the most remote corners of the island, seeking shelter from forces that their ancestors had only described in the darkest of cautionary tales. Yet even as the battle reached its crescendo, even as the very foundations of Solstheim began to crack and split beneath the assault of competing Thu'um, neither Vahlok nor Miraak showed any sign of yielding. Their conflict had transcended mere personal animosity or political disagreement. It had become a cosmic struggle between order and chaos, between the established patterns of reality and the infinite possibilities that lay beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. The moment when Solstheim finally tore free from the mainland of Skyrim was marked not by any single devastating attack, but by the cumulative effect of days of sustained magical violence. The bedrock itself, weakened by constant exposure to forces that defied natural law, simply could no longer maintain its structural integrity. With a sound like the breaking of the world itself, the island separated from its parent continent, carried away by currents both oceanic and metaphysical to its new position in the Sea of Ghosts. In that moment of geological catastrophe, as the earth itself screamed in protest at the violence being done to it, Vahlok finally gained the advantage he needed. Whether through superior skill, greater endurance, or simply the favor of the gods he served, he managed to break through Miraak's defenses and deliver a blow that brought the first Dragonborn to his knees. The forbidden knowledge that had seemed to promise infinite power proved insufficient in the face of unwavering determination and righteous fury. As Vahlok raised his weapon for the killing blow, as victory seemed finally within reach for the forces of order and tradition, the intervention came that would define the rest of Miraak's existence. Hermaeus Mora, the Daedric prince who had first corrupted the ambitious dragon priest with promises of forbidden knowledge, was not about to allow his champion to perish at the hands of a mere mortal. The Prince of Fate had invested too much in Miraak's development, had revealed too many secrets to allow his chosen servant to die before his true purpose could be fulfilled. The tentacles of otherworldly power that suddenly erupted from beneath the shattered stones of Solstheim carried with them the stench of alien dimensions and the whisper of knowledge too terrible for mortal minds to comprehend. They wrapped around Miraak's broken form with gentle persistence, drawing him down through cracks in reality that opened like wounds in the fabric of existence itself. In seconds that seemed to stretch for eternity, The first Dragonborn vanished from the mortal realm, pulled into the infinite library of Apocrypha, where time held no meaning and knowledge was both currency and poison. Vahlok, robbed of his victory by forces beyond his understanding, stood alone among the ruins of what had once been a temple to draconic power. The battle was over, but the war itself remained unresolved. Miraak had escaped justice, spirited away to a realm where mortal law held no sway and draconic authority meant nothing. The threat he represented had not been eliminated, merely postponed to some distant future when the barriers between worlds might grow thin enough for his return. The dragons, witnessing the destruction wrought by their rebellious priest and the intervention of powers they could not control, made their own calculations about the future. They appointed Vahlok as the new ruler of Solstheim, recognizing in him the strength and loyalty necessary to maintain order in a land that had been literally torn from its foundations. More importantly, they charged him with an eternal vigil, to watch for signs of Miraak's return and to be ready to face him again when that dark day finally arrived. Thus began the long watch that would define Solstheim's character for millennia to come. Vahlok established himself in the ruins of Miraak's temple, transforming what had once been a center of rebellion into a fortress of vigilance. His followers, those dragon priests who had remained loyal throughout the crisis, took up positions throughout the island, creating a network of observation and defense that would endure long after the Dragon War had ended and the age of draconic rule had passed into memory. The Skald, meanwhile, began the long process of adapting to their transformed homeland. The island that had been torn from Skyrim bore scars that would never fully heal, geographical features that spoke of the violence of its birth, and the ongoing tension between order and chaos that defined its existence. They developed new traditions and new stories to explain the changed world around them, weaving the tale of Miraak's betrayal and Vahlok's vigil into the very fabric of their cultural identity. In the realm of Apocrypha, surrounded by books whose pages contained knowledge that could drive mortals mad with revelation, Miraak began his long exile. The tentacles of Hermaeus Mora's domain wrapped around him like chains made of living shadow, binding him to a fate he had never truly understood when he first opened that fateful black book. He had sought power and found imprisonment, had reached for godhood, and discovered that even gods could be slaves to forces greater than themselves. Yet even in his captivity, even surrounded by the infinite wisdom and terrible knowledge of the Daedric prince's realm, Miraak's ambition remained unbroken. He began immediately to study the secrets available to him, to delve deeper into mysteries that had been forbidden even to dragon priests. If he could not escape through force, perhaps he could find another way, a path that would not only return him to the mortal realm, but would grant him power sufficient to challenge even Hermaeus Mora himself. The black books became his constant companions, their pages revealing secrets of reality's construction and the hidden pathways that connected all things. He learned of the cosmic forces that shaped existence, of the delicate balance between order and chaos that maintained the stability of all worlds. Most importantly, he discovered that his imprisonment was not as absolute as it might appear, that even from within Apocrypha, it might be possible to extend his influence back into the realm he had been forced to abandon. The centuries that followed Miraak's imprisonment in Apocrypha became a testament to the corrupting nature of forbidden knowledge and the terrible patience of those who dwell beyond mortal understanding. While the world above continued its inexorable march through the ages, witnessing the rise and fall of empires, the birth of heroes, and the deaths of gods, the first Dragonborn remained trapped in a realm where time itself bent to the will of its master. Yet this imprisonment, meant to contain his ambition, instead became the crucible in which it was refined and strengthened. Within the writhing corridors of Hermaeus Mora's domain, where books floated through air thick with the whispers of lost knowledge and tentacles emerged from pools of ink, to drag the unwary into eternal servitude, Miraak discovered that his exile was not the ending he had feared, but merely another beginning. The Daedric Prince's realm offered opportunities for growth that no mortal institution could match, access to secrets that predated the creation of Mundus itself, and insights into the fundamental nature of reality that would have driven lesser minds to madness within moments of exposure. The black books that surrounded him contained more than mere historical accounts or magical formulae. They were repositories of possibility itself, chronicles of events that had never occurred, treatises on laws of nature that existed only in theoretical frameworks, and prophecies that described futures so distant that the very stars would have changed their positions by the time they came to pass. Each page turned revealed new vistas of understanding, new pathways to power that no dragon priest had ever imagined possible. As the first era dawned in the world above, bringing with it the rise of the Nords and the decline of draconic influence, Miraak delved deeper into studies that would have horrified his former colleagues. He learned to navigate the shifting geography of Apocrypha, to read the signs that indicated when new knowledge had been added to the prince's collection, to distinguish between wisdom that could be safely absorbed and revelations that would destroy the mind that attempted to comprehend them. His understanding of the Thu'um evolved beyond anything achieved by mortal practitioners, incorporating elements drawn from the deepest mysteries of creation itself. The relationship between Miraak and Hermaeus Mora during these long centuries of exile was complex beyond mortal understanding. The Daedric prince had saved his champion from death, but this salvation came with chains that bound more tightly than any physical restraint. Miraak was free to explore the infinite library, to study its contents and grow in knowledge and power, but he could never leave. Every attempt to find an exit from Apocrypha led only to deeper chambers filled with more books, more secrets, more tantalizing glimpses of the ultimate understanding that always remained just beyond his grasp. Yet even as Miraak grew in power and knowledge, even as he mastered techniques that would have made him godlike by the standards of his own era, he never forgot his ultimate goal. The mortal realm called to him across the barriers between worlds, promising him the dominion he had always craved and the revenge he believed he deserved. His studies in Apocrypha were not pursued for their own sake, but as preparation for his eventual return, as gathering of resources that would ensure his triumph when he finally found a way to escape his otherworldly prison. The Daedric prince, for his part, seemed content to allow his champion to pursue these studies, even when they touched upon subjects that might theoretically provide means of escape. Hermaeus Mora's understanding of fate and possibility far exceeded that of any mortal, and perhaps he saw in Miraak's efforts not a threat to his dominion, but merely another chapter in a story whose ending had been written before its beginning. The Prince of Knowledge collected information not just about what was and what had been, but about what might be, and Miraak's ambitions provided him with data about mortal nature that could not be obtained through any other means. As the Second Era approached, bringing with it upheavals that would reshape the political landscape of Tamriel, Miraak began to sense opportunities that had not existed during his early centuries of exile. The barriers between realms had never been absolute, and periods of great change in the mortal world often created fluctuations that could be exploited by those with sufficient knowledge and patience. Wars, plagues, and the rise and fall of empires all created ripples in the fabric of reality, tiny weaknesses that a sufficiently skilled practitioner might be able to exploit. The development of new magical techniques in the mortal realm also provided Miraak with fresh avenues of study. As conjuration magic evolved and summoning practices became more sophisticated, the boundaries between Apocrypha and Mundus experienced stresses they had not known before. Each summoning of a Daedric entity created a momentary connection between realms, a pathway that existed for only seconds, but could be studied and understood by one with the patience to observe thousands of such events over the course of centuries. Miraak's understanding of these phenomena grew to encompass not just their immediate effects, but their cumulative impact on the structure of reality itself. He began to perceive patterns in the chaos, to identify the specific conditions that would need to be met for him to project his influence back into the mortal realm. The knowledge required was vast and complex, touching upon disciplines that ranged from theoretical metaphysics to practical enchantment, but he had both the resources of Apocrypha and unlimited time in which to pursue his studies. The Third Era brought changes that resonated even in the depths of Hermaeus Mora's realm. The rise of the Septim Empire, the establishment of the Mages Guild, and the increasing sophistication of magical education throughout Tamriel all contributed to a subtle but measurable increase in the permeability of dimensional boundaries. More mortals were attempting summoning rituals. More experiments were being conducted that touched upon the fundamental nature of reality. And more knowledge was being accumulated that paralleled secrets contained within the black books of Apocrypha. It was during this period that Miraak first began to experiment with projecting his consciousness beyond the confines of his prison. These early attempts were crude and limited, barely managing to extend his awareness to the edges of Apocrypha's influence before being drawn back by the inexorable pull of the realm's binding forces. Yet each failure taught him something new about the nature of his imprisonment and the specific mechanisms that kept him bound to Hermaeus Mora's domain. The breakthrough came not through brute force or elaborate ritual, but through a subtle understanding of the relationship between knowledge and reality that only someone who had spent centuries in Apocrypha could achieve. Miraak realized that his consciousness had become so intertwined with the prince's realm that traditional methods of escape would never work. Instead of trying to break free from Apocrypha, he needed to find a way to extend Apocrypha's influence into the mortal realm, creating a bridge between worlds that would allow him to operate in both simultaneously. This realization led to years of careful preparation and experimentation. Miraak studied the dreams of mortals, learning to recognize the patterns that indicated a mind particularly susceptible to outside influence. He practiced extending his awareness through the subtle connections that linked all conscious beings, following pathways of thought and memory that existed beyond the normal boundaries of individual identity. Most importantly, he began to understand how the Allmaker stones of Solstheim could be used as focal points for his power, ancient artifacts whose connection to the fundamental forces of creation made them ideal conduits for otherworldly influence. The Allmaker stones had been placed on Solstheim by forces that predated even the dragon cult, serving as markers of sacred sites, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. The Skal had long revered these monuments, understanding intuitively that they represented connections to powers beyond mortal comprehension. What they did not realize was that these same connections could be exploited by one with sufficient knowledge and patience, turned from sources of natural harmony into tools of supernatural domination. Miraak's plan required not just the ability to influence the stones themselves, but the capacity to control the minds of those who lived near them. This necessitated the development of techniques that could operate across dimensional boundaries, methods of mental manipulation that could function even when the practitioner was trapped in an entirely different realm. The solution lay in the realm of dreams, those mysterious mental states where consciousness became fluid and the normal rules of identity and agency held less sway. Dreams had always been a pathway between worlds, a natural phenomenon that allowed mortal minds to touch upon realms of experience normally beyond their reach. By learning to navigate the dream realm with the same skill he had developed in exploring Apocrypha, Miraak discovered that he could reach the sleeping minds of Solstheim's inhabitants and plant suggestions that would compel them to act according to his will. These influences were subtle at first, manifesting as strange dreams and inexplicable urges that the affected individuals dismissed as products of their own subconscious minds. The beauty of this approach lay in its invisibility. Unlike the crude domination effects achieved through conventional Thuum techniques, dream manipulation left no obvious signs of external influence. The victims retained their personalities and memories, their ability to make decisions and interact normally with their communities. They simply found themselves compelled by urges they could not explain, driven to perform actions that served Miraak's purposes, while believing these actions to be expressions of their own free will. As the Fourth Era dawned and the political landscape of Tamriel shifted once again, Miraak's influence over Solstheim began to manifest in increasingly obvious ways. The island's inhabitants started experiencing shared dreams of a figure in a distinctive mask, a presence that spoke to them in words of power and promised them purpose beyond their mundane daily existence. Some dismissed these dreams as mere fantasy, but others found themselves drawn to the Allmaker stones during their sleeping hours, compelled to begin construction projects whose ultimate purpose remained hidden even from themselves. The rebuilding of Miraak's temple began during this period, carried out by islanders who worked through the night in a trance-like state, their hands guided by knowledge they did not consciously possess. Ancient architectural techniques that had been lost for millennia were somehow remembered and applied, resulting in construction that proceeded at an impossible pace despite the apparent lack of conscious planning or coordination among the workers. Each dawn found new progress had been made. New chambers carved from solid stone, new passages that led deeper into the island's mysterious interior. Simultaneously, other islanders found themselves drawn to the Allmaker stones, compelled to construct elaborate arrangements of stone and metal around these ancient monuments. These structures, which came to be known as the cleansing stones, served a purpose that went far beyond their apparent function as simple architectural additions. They were designed to focus and amplify the natural energies that flowed through the stones, creating conduits that could channel power across dimensional boundaries with unprecedented efficiency. The Skull Shamans were among the first to recognize that something unnatural was occurring on their island. Their connection to the traditional ways of their people made them sensitive to disturbances in the spiritual balance that had maintained Solstheim's harmony for generations. They spoke of dreams that felt too real to be mere fantasy, of voices that called from beyond the edge of hearing, of shadows that moved independently of their sources. Yet even their ancient wisdom proved insufficient to understand the true nature of the threat they faced. Some of Solstheim's inhabitants proved more susceptible to Miraak's influence than others, and these individuals began to develop what could only be described as a conscious cult devoted to the first Dragonborn's worship. Unlike the unconscious workers who labored in their sleep, these followers retained full awareness of their devotion, speaking openly of their master's imminent return and the glorious future he would bring to their island. They established shrines in hidden locations, performed rituals that drew upon knowledge no living person should have possessed, and served as focal points for Miraak's growing influence over the mortal realm. The psychological effects of prolonged exposure to Miraak's dream manipulation varied considerably among Solstheim's population. Some individuals experienced only minor symptoms, occasional confusion, dreams that seemed unusually vivid, and inexplicable urges to visit certain locations on the island. Others suffered more severe consequences, including memory loss, personality changes, and periods of complete dissociation during which they would perform complex tasks without any conscious awareness of their actions. Most disturbing of all were those who seemed to exist in a state somewhere between consciousness and dream. Individuals who spoke of serving a master they could not clearly remember while displaying knowledge of events and techniques that should have been beyond their understanding. These unfortunate souls served as living bridges between Miraak's realm and the mortal world, their corrupted consciousness providing pathways through which his influence could flow with ever-increasing strength and clarity. As Miraak's power over Solstheim grew, so did his ability to perceive events occurring in the wider world beyond his island stronghold. Through the dreams of his followers and the subtle connections that linked all conscious beings, he became aware of developments that would have profound implications for his plans. The return of dragons to Skyrim, the emergence of another Dragonborn, and the weakening of barriers between realms all pointed toward an approaching convergence that would provide him with opportunities he had waited millennia to exploit. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Solstheim, but the balance of power between mortal and Daedric realms. Miraak had spent 4,000 years preparing for this moment, accumulating knowledge and power that dwarfed anything he had possessed during his original rebellion against the dragons. His exile in Apocrypha, meant to contain his ambition, had instead transformed him into something far more dangerous than he had ever been as a mere dragon priest. The first Dragonborn was ready to reclaim his place in the mortal world, and this time he would not be satisfied with mere rebellion against draconic authority. His goals had evolved during his long exile, expanding to encompass dominion over all of Tamriel, and perhaps even the power to challenge the Daedric prince, who had both saved and imprisoned him. The knowledge contained within the Black Books had shown him possibilities that stretched far beyond anything he had originally imagined, and his patience had been rewarded with opportunities that no dragon priest of the Merethic era could have conceived. The return of Miraak to active influence in the mortal realm marked the beginning of a new chapter in Tamriel's history, one that would test the boundaries between knowledge and madness, between ambition and wisdom, between the power of ancient secrets and the strength of those who would stand against them. The island of Solstheim, torn from Skyrim's mainland by the violence of his first rebellion, would once again serve as the stage for conflicts that would determine the fate of nations and the future of mortal civilization itself. The machinations that had begun in the realm of dreams would soon manifest in the waking world, with consequences that stretched far beyond the borders of Solstheim itself. For across the sea, in the ancient province of Skyrim, events were unfolding that would create the perfect conditions for Miraak's long-awaited return to prominence. The World Eater had awakened from his exile in time, and with his return came the emergence of another Dragonborn, whose very existence would serve as both catalyst and threat to the first Dragonborn's carefully laid plans. The irony was not lost on those few who understood the deeper currents of fate that flowed beneath the surface of observable events. Alduin's return to Tamriel represented the fulfillment of ancient prophecies and the completion of cycles that had been set in motion during the Dragon War itself. Yet this cosmic event, which should have demanded the attention of every Dragonborn who had ever lived, instead provided Miraak with the distraction he needed to advance his own agenda. While heroes gathered to face the World Eater, while the songs of ancient Nords echoed once more through the halls of Sovngarde, the first Dragonborn pursued his own path toward a different kind of apocalypse. The emergence of the last Dragonborn in Skyrim created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate sphere of their adventures. Each dragon's soul absorbed by this new champion resonated through the metaphysical connections that linked all those who bore the dragon blood, sending tremors through the barriers that separated realms and dimensions. Miraak, with his consciousness stretched across multiple planes of existence, felt each of these victories as both validation of his own nature and theft of power that rightfully belonged to him. From his perspective, shaped by millennia of exile and corruption, the last Dragonborn represented both an opportunity and an intolerable insult. Here was another who possessed the same fundamental nature that had elevated him above common mortality. Yet this newcomer operated with the freedom that had been denied to him for 4,000 years. They could walk freely between provinces, could choose their own battles and alliances, could grow in power without the constant oversight of a Daedric prince whose tentacles wrapped around every aspect of their existence. Yet the very freedom that made the last Dragonborn an object of envy also made them vulnerable to influences that a more experienced practitioner would have recognized and resisted. Their rapid absorption of dragon souls, while impressive by the standards of mortal heroes, lacked the careful cultivation and understanding that Miraak had developed through centuries of study in Apocrypha. They possessed raw power in abundance, but their knowledge of its deeper implications remained limited by the constraints of mortal education and experience. This imbalance between power and wisdom created opportunities that Miraak was uniquely positioned to exploit. Through the dream pathways he had spent so long learning to navigate, he began to extend his influence toward this new Dragonborn, seeking to establish connections that would allow him to siphon away portions of their accumulated strength. These initial contacts were subtle, manifesting as strange visions during moments of rest or meditation, fleeting images of a masked figure who spoke in words of power that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to the dragon's soul within. The techniques Miraak employed for these long-distance manipulations represented the culmination of his studies in Apocrypha, combining elements of dream magic, soul manipulation, and dimensional theory into approaches that no mortal mage could have conceived or countered. He had learned to treat consciousness itself as a form of territory that could be conquered and occupied, to view the boundaries between individual minds as obstacles that could be overcome through sufficient knowledge and patience. Each stolen dragon soul that found its way to Miraak through these ethereal channels served multiple purposes in his greater design. The raw power contained within these essences strengthened his ability to maintain consciousness across multiple realms simultaneously, while the memories and knowledge each dragon had accumulated during its lifetime provided him with updated information about the current state of the world above. Through the eyes of ancient worms, he witnessed the changes that had transformed Tamriel during his absence, the rise and fall of empires, the evolution of magical practices, and the shifting balance of power between mortal and divine forces. The dragons whose souls were intercepted by Miraak's influence carried within their memories not just the events they had witnessed, but the deeper currents of change that had shaped the world during the Fourth Era. Through these stolen recollections, he learned of the Oblivion Crisis and its aftermath, of the decline of the Empire and the growing independence of the provinces, of technological and magical innovations that had emerged during his exile. Most importantly, he gained insight into the current state of dimensional barriers and the various factors that might be exploited to facilitate his return to physical manifestation in the mortal realm. This intelligence gathering served to refine and focus Miraak's plans for his eventual confrontation with both the last Dragonborn and the wider world beyond Solstheim. He recognized that the Tamriel of the Fourth Era was a very different place from the one he had known during the height of the dragon cult, with new centers of power, new magical traditions, and new threats that would need to be accounted for in any comprehensive strategy for conquest. The knowledge contained within the stolen dragon souls provided him with the information necessary to adapt his ancient ambitions to contemporary realities. Yet even as Miraak's influence over the dragon souls grew stronger, even as his ability to reach across dimensional boundaries became more refined and effective, he remained fundamentally constrained by his imprisonment within Apocrypha. The power he accumulated through these ethereal thefts could strengthen his presence within Hermaeus Mora's realm and enhance his ability to project influence into the mortal world. But it could not provide him with the physical form necessary for direct action in the realm of his birth. This limitation forced him to rely increasingly heavily on his followers in Solstheim, both the conscious cultists who served him willingly and the unconscious workers who labored under the influence of his dream manipulations. The temple complex that rose from the ruins of his ancient stronghold became not just a monument to his vanity, but a practical necessity for his plans, a focal point through which his influence could be concentrated and directed with maximum efficiency. The architecture of the rebuilt temple reflected both Miraak's original aesthetic preferences and the alien knowledge he had absorbed during his long exile in Apocrypha. Ancient Nordic construction techniques were combined with geometric principles drawn from the impossible mathematics of Hermaeus Mora's realm, creating structures that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions simultaneously. The passages twisted and turned according to patterns that defied conventional understanding of space and direction, while the chambers expanded and contracted in response to the presence or absence of their master's influence. At the heart of this architectural maze lay the sanctum, where Miraak's physical form rested in a state that transcended normal concepts of life and death. His body, preserved through techniques learned in the realm of forbidden knowledge, served as an anchor point for his consciousness as it ranged across multiple planes of existence. This physical shell remained technically alive, sustained by energies drawn from the Allmaker stones and the accumulated power of stolen dragon souls. Yet it existed in a suspended state that allowed his mind to operate independently of normal biological constraints. The relationship between Miraak's imprisoned consciousness and his preserved physical form created unique opportunities for interaction with the mortal realm that even Hermaeus Mora had not fully anticipated. While the Daedric Prince could monitor and influence his champion's mental activities within Apocrypha, the subtle connections between mind and body allowed for forms of communication and influence that operated outside the normal channels of Daedric oversight. This loophole in his cosmic imprisonment provided Miraak with degrees of freedom that would prove crucial to his ultimate plans for escape and revenge. The cultists who tended to Miraak's physical form during his long absence developed their own interpretations of his nature and purpose, creating theological frameworks that blended traditional Nordic beliefs with insights drawn from their dreams and visions. They spoke of their master as a bridge between worlds, a being who had transcended the limitations of mortal existence while retaining the ambitions and desires that drove all great conquerors. Their worship took forms that would have been recognizable to the ancient dragon cult, yet it incorporated elements drawn from Daedric practices and philosophical concepts that reflected their exposure to otherworldly influences. These devoted followers served as more than mere caretakers of Miraak's earthly remains. They functioned as a distributed network of consciousness that extended his awareness throughout Solstheim and beyond, their minds linked to his through bonds forged in shared dreams and sustained through ritual practices that drew upon both Nordic tradition and alien knowledge. Through their eyes, he could observe events occurring anywhere on the island. Through their hands, he could manipulate physical objects and influence the behavior of other inhabitants. Through their voices, he could speak words of power that carried the full weight of his accumulated authority. The psychological toll of serving as conduits for Miraak's consciousness proved severe for many of these devoted individuals. The human mind was not designed to serve as a vessel for awareness drawn from multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, and prolonged exposure to such influences inevitably resulted in various forms of mental degradation. Some cultists experienced progressive memory loss, forgetting not just recent events, but fundamental aspects of their own identities as their personalities became increasingly subsumed into their master's greater consciousness. Others suffered from what could only be described as temporal displacement, experiencing events from Miraak's past as if they were occurring in the present, speaking in languages that had been dead for millennia, and displaying knowledge of historical events they could not possibly have witnessed. These unfortunate souls existed in a state of perpetual confusion between past and present, their consciousness scattered across multiple time periods as they struggled to maintain coherent identities while serving as channels for memories that spanned thousands of years. The most severely affected cultists appeared to lose all sense of individual identity entirely, becoming little more than extensions of Miraak's will manifested in physical form. These hollow-eyed servants moved through the temple complex with mechanical precision, performing complex tasks without conscious thought or awareness, their bodies animated by purpose that originated entirely outside themselves. They served as living proof of both the extent of Miraak's power and the terrible price paid by those who served as vessels for consciousness that transcended mortal limitations. Yet despite the obvious dangers involved in such service, New followers continued to be drawn to Miraak's cause throughout the Fourth Era. The dreams he sent carried with them not just commands and visions, but genuine insights into the nature of power and the hidden forces that shaped reality. For individuals who had spent their lives feeling powerless and insignificant, the opportunity to participate in cosmic events that would reshape the world proved irresistibly attractive, even when the price of such participation was the gradual dissolution of their individual identity. The knowledge that flowed through these dream connections was not entirely one-directional. While Miraak used his followers as sources of information about current events and conditions in the mortal realm, their mortal perspectives also provided him with insights into contemporary culture and psychology that proved invaluable for refining his manipulation techniques. Through their experiences, he learned how the people of the Fourth Era thought and felt, what motivated them, what fears drove them, and what promises might convince them to abandon their existing loyalties in favor of service to a power they could not fully comprehend. This understanding of mortal psychology became increasingly important as Miraak's plans evolved to encompass not just the conquest of Solstheim, but the eventual domination of all Tamriel. The techniques that had proven effective for controlling a relatively small population of isolated islanders would need to be scaled up and adapted for use against the much larger and more diverse populations of the mainland provinces. The cultural, political, and religious differences between various ethnic groups would require different approaches, different promises, and different threats to achieve the same fundamental goal of absolute submission to his will. The Allmaker stones that dotted Solstheim's landscape became focal points not just for Miraak's immediate influence over the island's inhabitants, but for his broader study of the connections that linked all conscious beings throughout Tamriel. These ancient monuments served as natural amplifiers for psychic energies, allowing him to extend his awareness far beyond the normal limitations imposed by distance and dimensional barriers. Through careful manipulation of the forces that flowed through these sacred sites, he could touch the dreams of individuals hundreds of miles away, planting seeds of influence that might not manifest for years, but would eventually serve his greater purpose. The corruption of the Allmaker stones represented a profound violation of the natural order that had maintained Solstheim's spiritual balance for countless generations. The Skal shamans who served as guardians of these sacred sites reported increasingly disturbing phenomena. Visions that contradicted their traditional understanding of the world, voices that spoke from within the stones themselves, and changes in the natural rhythms that had governed their ceremonies since time immemorial. Their attempts to cleanse these corrupted sites through traditional rituals proved ineffective against influences that operated according to principles far removed from the natural magic they understood. Some of the more perceptive Skal elders began to suspect that the disturbances affecting their sacred sites were connected to the strange behavior exhibited by increasing numbers of Solstheim's inhabitants. The correlation between proximity to corrupted Allmaker stones and susceptibility to Miraak's dream influence was too consistent to be coincidental, yet the mechanisms underlying this connection remained beyond their ability to comprehend or counter. Their shamanic traditions, while effective for dealing with natural spiritual imbalances, provided no guidance for confronting influences that originated in realms beyond the normal cycle of life and death. The helplessness experienced by these traditional guardians in the face of corruption they could not understand or combat served Miraak's purposes in ways that extended beyond the immediate practical advantages of controlling the Allmaker stones. The visible failure of ancient wisdom and traditional authority created psychological conditions that made the affected populations more receptive to alternative sources of guidance and protection. When the old ways proved inadequate to explain or address the changes occurring around them, people naturally began to seek new sources of meaning and purpose, sources that Miraak was uniquely positioned to provide through his dream communications. The gradual transformation of Solstheim under Miraak's influence created a testing ground for techniques and approaches that he intended to eventually deploy on a much larger scale. The island served as a laboratory where he could experiment with different methods of population control different approaches to architectural and social organization, and different ways of balancing overt domination with subtle manipulation. The lessons learned from these experiments would inform his strategies for conquering the mainland provinces once he had achieved his immediate goal of escaping from his dimensional prison. The success of his influence over Solstheim's population also provided Miraak with practical resources that would prove essential for his larger ambitions. The temple complex that rose under his direction was more than just a monument to his ego. It was a functional facility designed to serve as a base of operations for activities that would extend far beyond the island's shores. The chambers carved deep into Solstheim's bedrock contained workshops where his followers crafted artifacts imbued with otherworldly power, libraries where forbidden knowledge was transcribed and preserved, and ritual spaces where ceremonies were conducted that drew upon energies from multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The artifacts created in these underground workshops represented fusion of traditional Nordic craftsmanship with techniques learned in Apocrypha, resulting in items that possessed properties that defied conventional understanding of enchantment and magical theory. Weapons forged in these facilities could cut through dimensional barriers as easily as mortal flesh, while armor created through these processes provided protection not just against physical attacks, but against various forms of mental and spiritual assault. These creations would serve as tools for Miraak's eventual return to active involvement in mortal affairs, providing him with resources that no contemporary mage or warrior could match or counter. The knowledge preserved in the temple's hidden libraries encompassed not just the secrets Miraak had learned during his exile in Apocrypha, but also information gathered from the dreams and memories of his followers throughout Tamriel. This intelligence network, built through years of patient cultivation and maintained through dream connections that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness, provided him with detailed information about the current political, military, and magical capabilities of every major faction and institution throughout the continent. Through the memories of his unconscious agents, Miraak learned of the College of Winterhold's current research projects, the strategic priorities of various provincial governments, the theological debates occurring within different religious organizations, and the personal ambitions and weaknesses of individual leaders who might either serve his purposes or pose threats to his plans. This comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation represented perhaps the most sophisticated espionage network ever assembled in Tamrielic history, made possible only by the unique combination of Daedric knowledge and Dragonborn power that Miraak had spent millennia learning to wield. The information flowing through these channels also allowed him to monitor the activities of the last Dragonborn with unprecedented precision and detail. Every dragon encountered, every shout learned, every artifact acquired by this new champion was reported through the dream network that connected all those touched by Miraak's influence. This surveillance served multiple purposes. It allowed him to track the growth of a potential rival's power. It provided him with opportunities to intercept dragon souls before they could be absorbed by another, and it gave him insights into the personality and decision-making patterns of the individual, who might ultimately stand between him and his goals. The psychological profile that emerged from this extended observation revealed both strengths and weaknesses that would prove crucial to Miraak's eventual strategy for dealing with his potential rival. The last Dragonborn demonstrated remarkable adaptability and growth potential, rapidly mastering new techniques and overcoming seemingly impossible challenges through a combination of raw determination and intuitive understanding of power dynamics. Yet this same adaptability was coupled with a tendency toward reactive rather than proactive planning, a preference for responding to immediate threats rather than anticipating and preparing for future challenges. These observations suggested approaches that might prove effective for manipulating or defeating the last Dragonborn when the inevitable confrontation finally occurred. The key would be controlling the circumstances of their encounter, creating situations where reactive responses would prove insufficient, and where the superior planning and preparation that Miraak had invested in his return would provide decisive advantages. The dream-influenced techniques that had proven so effective with ordinary mortals might also be applicable to a Dragonborn, particularly one whose understanding of such phenomena remained limited by conventional magical education. As the events unfolding in Skyrim moved toward their climax, as Alduin's threat was finally addressed and the last Dragonborn's reputation grew throughout the province, Miraak recognized that the time for subtle manipulation and gradual preparation was drawing to a close. The cosmic forces that had been set in motion by the World Eater's return were creating conditions of instability and change that would not persist indefinitely. If he was going to exploit these opportunities to achieve his escape from Apocrypha and his return to physical manifestation in the mortal realm, he would need to act while the barriers between dimensions remained weakened by the recent upheavals. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Solstheim or even Skyrim, but the future relationship between mortal and Daedric powers throughout Tamriel. Miraak had spent 4 millennia preparing for this moment, accumulating knowledge and power that dwarfed anything possessed by his ancient contemporaries, developing techniques and strategies that incorporated insights drawn from realms beyond mortal understanding. His exile, meant to contain his ambition, had instead transformed him into something far more dangerous than he had ever been as a mere dragon priest of the Merethic era. The first Dragonborn was ready to reclaim his birthright and fulfill ambitions that had been deferred but never abandoned. The island of Solstheim, shaped by the violence of his first rebellion and transformed by millennia of his subtle influence, would serve once again as the stage for conflicts that would test the limits of mortal heroism against power drawn from the deepest wells of forbidden knowledge. The age of patient preparation was ending, and the time for direct action was finally at hand. The culmination of Miraak's millennia-long preparation came not through grand proclamation or cosmic cataclysm, but through the subtle convergence of forces that had been building since the moment he first opened that fateful black book in the depths of his ancient temple. The barriers between Apocrypha and Mundus, weakened by the upheavals surrounding Alduin's return and the emergence of another Dragonborn, finally thinned to the point where his accumulated power could breach them with sufficient force to manifest his will directly in the mortal realm. The process began with what the few remaining Skal shamans would later describe as the Night of Whispered Stone, when every Allmaker stone on Solstheim simultaneously began to emit sounds that resembled both the grinding of ancient machinery and the voices of the long dead. The cleansing stones that Miraak's unconscious servants had constructed around these monuments activated in sequence, creating a network of otherworldly energy that transformed the entire island into a massive ritual circle whose purpose transcended anything conceived by mortal magic. Through this network, Miraak's consciousness finally achieved the breakthrough he had sought for 4,000 years. His awareness, no longer confined to the shifting libraries of Apocrypha or the limited perspectives of his dream-touched followers, expanded to encompass the entirety of Solstheim, with a clarity and immediacy that surpassed even his original incarnation as a dragon priest. The island became an extension of his being, every stone and tree and stream responding to his will as naturally as his own limbs had in life. Yet even as he savoured this return to direct influence over the physical world, Miraak remained acutely aware that his victory was incomplete. His consciousness had escaped the confines of Hermaeus Mora's realm, but his physical form remained suspended in that otherworldly sanctum, sustained by energies that bound him as surely as any chain. True freedom would require not just the projection of his will into Mundus, but the complete severing of his connection to the Daedric prince who had both saved and enslaved him. The knowledge necessary for such liberation existed within the accumulated lore of Apocrypha, scattered across countless black books and encoded in the testimonies of mortals who had attempted similar escapes throughout history. Most had failed, their consciousness dissolving into the infinite library, or their ambitions crushed by the prince's inexorable will. Yet Miraak's unique nature as Dragonborn combined with the power he had accumulated through millennia of patient study, suggested possibilities that had never existed for previous challengers. The key lay in understanding that Hermaeus Mora's power over him derived not from brute force, but from the fundamental nature of knowledge itself. Every secret learned, every technique mastered, every insight gained in Apocrypha had created connections that bound the learner more tightly to the source of that knowledge. The prince's realm was not merely a prison, but a web of intellectual dependency that grew stronger with each revelation absorbed by those who dwelt within it. Breaking free would require more than simply rejecting this accumulated knowledge or attempting to forget what had been learned. Such approaches had been tried by others and had invariably failed, as the attempt to unknow what was known only served to reinforce the very connections one sought to sever. Instead, Miraak's escape would need to be built upon a foundation of knowledge so complete and self-contained that it no longer required external validation or support. This was the true purpose behind his long exile and patient study, not merely to grow in power or accumulate forbidden lore, but to achieve a state of understanding so comprehensive that he could become his own source of cosmic knowledge, independent of any external authority or influence. The transformation from student to master, from seeker to source, represented the ultimate expression of the ambition that had driven him since his first rebellion against the dragons. The confrontation with the last Dragonborn, when it finally came, would serve as the catalyst for this final transformation. Through battle with one who shared his fundamental nature, yet remained bound by the limitations of mortal understanding, Miraak would demonstrate not just his superior power, but his transcendence of the very categories that defined Dragonborn existence. Victory would prove his worthiness to claim dominion not just over Tamriel, but over the cosmic forces that shaped reality itself. Yet in the depths of his restored awareness, in moments when the weight of accumulated knowledge briefly lifted from his consciousness, Miraak sometimes glimpsed reflections of the man he had once been. The dragon priest, who had served faithfully before corruption. The leader who had possessed the power to aid his people in their darkest hour, yet had chosen personal ambition instead. These memories, preserved despite millennia of otherworldly influence, served as reminders of paths not taken and choices that could never be undone. Perhaps it was fitting that his story would find its resolution on the same island where it had begun, where the violence of his first rebellion had torn the very land from its foundations. Solstheim had been shaped by his ambition and marked by his failure, transformed by his exile and restored through his influence. Here, where the boundaries between past and present blurred like the shifting mists that shrouded its ancient peaks, the first Dragonborn would finally discover whether the power he had sought for so long would prove to be salvation or damnation. The whispers that had once called to him from the pages of black books now spoke with his own voice, carrying across the frozen landscape promises of dominion and threats of destruction in equal measure. The age of patient waiting was ending, and the final chapter of Miraak's legend was about to be written in dragon fire and blood upon the stones of the island that had become both his prison and his kingdom. Thus stands the tale of Miraak, the first Dragonborn, whose name shall be remembered as long as mortals speak of power and its price, of knowledge and its cost, of ambition that transcends the boundaries of mortality itself. In the end, his legacy serves as both warning and wonder, a reminder that even the greatest gifts can become the source of the greatest corruption, and that the line between hero and monster is often drawn not by power itself, but by the wisdom to know when that power should not be used.